Thank you. As Kara already asked, I know a bunch of you already read this book. You don't have to ask that question. And if you read the book to the very, very end, that past the end of the book, there's a little prologue. And in that, there's one little sentence that tells you that this is based upon a true story. And the true story occurred on San Nicolas Island. Okay? So what I want to do tonight is to try to relate to you the true story, or at least as much of it as we know. A lot of it is still shrouded in mystery, and there's a lot of confusing information out there. And I've been spending some time kind of sorting through all the various tales and bits of actual information that we've been able to sort out. And so I'll tell you where we're at right now. Okay. One of the amazing things is the novel was written, and it was one of the very first, Scott O'Dell was one of the very first authors to really write historical fiction. And historical fiction is where you research the place, the times, and the people that you're writing about. And you try to weave a story that is as real, as true to that time and those people as you can. Scott O'Dell wrote the novel, and it was published in 1960. At that time, most of what I'm going to tell you tonight was not known. This is stuff that's come out since then. So if you kind of set the bar in 1960, the information he had to work with, he did really a tremendous job. Plus, add to that the fact that he was never on San Nicolas Island, so all of his descriptions are secondhand. Though he did actually attempt, he did hire a boat and he did sail out around the island as close as he could at the time. And with binoculars, he got a good look at the island. Which is why actually some of his descriptions of what the island looks like are pretty good. Especially when you consider that he's like within about 5 miles, is about as close as he got. So he actually did a really good job. And of course, the novel, it is a novel, okay? It's a children's novel, so the heroine is a bit younger than she was in reality, but that's to appeal to kids. But the basic, tale of the story, being left alone on the island to fend for herself, is all very true. And so I just want to go through some of the actual facts of the story so you can better understand the true story and what that really meant to her. Okay, now first off, let's just start by establishing where we're at. If you're not too familiar, San Nicolas Island is the furthest out. Okay, it's 60 miles to the nearest point of land, which is Point Mabul on the mainland. It's 50 miles to Santa Cruz Island. It's 50 miles to Catalina Island. It's way out there. And it's very, very isolated. Even today, it's difficult to get to. The Navy has facilities out there, but transport to the island is regular, but you can't rely on it terribly even today because of some of the other factors. So just remember, we're talking about a place that is very isolated, and that's a real important part of the story. Just to give you a visual of the island, this is what it looks like. It's about 9 miles long. Okay. If you notice, there's not too much development other than obviously the airfield you can see here that the Navy built, and a little area here called Nick Town, which is where everyone lives, which is where the majority of the buildings are, and then there's other little scattered buildings around, but it's mostly left pretty much untouched. Which is one of the great things about the island, is that now when we go back and we try to research things like this, we do it through archaeology, and since so little the island's been developed, most of the archaeological sites are in real good shape. They're pretty much as they were left. There hasn't been a lot of disturbance, which is really great. Yeah. To look at it topographically, the island, as you can tell, up on top is pretty flat. This indicates pretty flat terrain. And all around that is very, very steep, very, very rugged canyons. Very difficult access, even today. This end, the west end of the island, is pretty much buried in sand dunes. Okay, and this topography is an important part of the story, so just keep that in mind as we go along. As I said, that central part is very flat. Well, it's flat. These are some of the steep canyons coming down off the side, as you can see. As I said, the west end is covered with sand dunes, and we have a lot of active sand dunes and a lot of stabilized sand dunes. Probably at the time that the lone woman was there, the sand dunes were probably fairly well stabilized. They became destabilized after the introduction of sheep ranching the sheep ate the vegetation and started the whole process of erosion over again. But it's always been a very sandy area, a lot of dune kind of vegetation. Now the island is, by definition, a desert, in that the rainfall is less than 8 inches a year. But there is a lot of fog, so we get a lot of moisture from the fog, and so we do get a reasonable amount of vegetation. But as you notice, the vegetation is all low-lying shrubs. There are no native trees. Okay, so this is where she would have had to live. Giant coreopsis is some of the biggest stuff that would have been growing at the time. Some of the flowers, morning glory. San Nicolas Island is known for two things. Historically, we read the accounts all through time. It's very foggy and it's very windy. You can probably tell by the way the tree grows that it's windy. Everybody complains about the wind and how terrible it is. And this is an important part of the story as well, so just keep that in mind. Now we do have, on San Nicolas Island, we have the island foxes, like you do on the Northern Islands. Our population is fairly large and stable, so it's not one of the endangered ones, but we do have the same sort of foxes on the island. Now the islands, you may know, the foxes on the southern islands, and that is San Nicolas, San Clemente, and Catalina, were apparently introduced to those islands by the Native Americans. And on San Nicolas Island, we have dated fox bones to 5,000 years ago. So we know that they were brought there at least 5,000 years ago. And we haven't found any evidence of them earlier, which is one of the reasons we believe that the Native Americans brought them out. We also have the island deer mouse on the island, which is also found on several of the other islands. And we have the island night lizard. Island night lizards are found on San Nicolas, San Clemente, and Santa Barbara Islands only, nowhere else in the world. They are one of our endangered species. And that's about the sum total of all the animals on land. So you can see there's not a whole lot on land. However, we do have some rather large bird rookeries and have traditionally, with western gulls in particular, and Brandt's cormorants. Traditionally had very large rookeries on the island. And there's a number of other seabirds that nest there off and on, but these are the two main ones that are always talked about historically. We do have, however, lots of marine mammals, lots of sea lions, and we have lots of elephant seals. We also have sea otters. And historically there were large numbers throughout the Channel Islands, as you may know. And this is a real important part of the story. Okay. We do have very rich tide pools all around the island that provide lots of food if you're a Native American and you want to eat such things. And we have lots of fish. Couldn't think of a good way to represent lots of fish, but this just seemed to kind of fit the bill. But a whole variety of fishes. The waters are kind of a mix of cold and warm, so we have many, many different species of fish that are available out there at the island. And we've also got some pretty neat geology. The island is primarily sandstone. Over 90% is sandstone, which is what this is, and it just erodes in very fantastic forms, especially along the shoreline. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what the island kind of looks like. Now, to give you some of the cultural background, it's real important to realize that I think everyone's familiar with the Chumash being in the Santa Barbara, Ventura areas. And the Chumash are related to the northern islands. That's actually where the name Chumash comes from, is from the Santa Cruz Island. But the southern islands, they're related to the Gabrielino that are in the Los Angeles area. Okay. And the difference here is that Chumash and Gabrielino they're from different language stocks. Okay, so it's like these guys are speaking German and these guys are speaking Chinese. There's no common relationship between the languages. Okay. There's a lot of commonality in the culture, in the way they're living, but where they're coming from, their language, probably their religion and rituals and things like that, are coming from totally different backgrounds. And they're kind of converging on, because they're living in the same environment, they're doing the same sorts of things. They're fishing and hunting sea mammals and collecting shellfish and things like this. So a lot of their material objects look very similar But there's a real deep-rooted cultural difference in them. This is an important part of the story as well. As I alluded to, San Nicolas is very remote and hard to get to. Okay. What I've done here is just kind of reconstructed some of the routes that probably Native Americans would have taken to get out there. And if you notice, it's not a question of coming straight out to the island, it's a matter of jumping from island to island. Okay, what this does, it reduces the length of time that you're at sea. This is 28 miles, this is about 24 miles. Instead of trying to make it 50 miles all the way across, this makes for a much safer journey. Okay, because this is a lot of water in between. And guess what? If you miss San Nicolas Island, guess what else is out there? Nothing. So probably what you're going to do is you're going to come by Catalina. It's a pretty big island. You can be seen from the mainland pretty clearly a lot of times. You make your way to Santa Barbara Island. And Santa Barbara Island's fairly small, but it sits about the water. And then you probably sit there for a day or two and wait to be sure that the weather's okay before you come all the way up to San Nicolas. Because one of the differences with San Nicolas is it's very low-lying, it's very flat. Very easy to get lost in the haze and the fog. So it's not an easy thing to sight on. So you want to be sure that you've got a good beat on it before you head on out. Okay. People have postulated possible journeys directly from the northern islands. I tend to doubt it. I think you would come down along the coast and make your way out like this, just because it's a much safer way to go. Remember, these are little wooden plank canoes, which you've probably seen. And the plank canoes they're seaworthy, but just barely. Okay. One of the positions on the crew is a young boy who comes along. His job is just to bail the water out because it looks on. Okay, so so they can make it, but it's not the safest thing. So you want to take the safest possible route. This will be the safest possible route to get out. Okay. Just to give you an idea on some of the artifacts, pretty typical shellfish hooks. They're doing a lot of fishing. These are some of the ornaments that we found out there. More ornaments. The San Nicolas Islanders are very well known for the very artistic, very well-crafted articles like this. In fact, if you look in most books about the Chumash or about the Gabrielino, if there's a real nice picture of an artifact in there, it's probably from San Nicolas Island. Read the little caption underneath. It probably came from San Nicolas. Just because, for whatever reason, San Nicolas is known for having all really nice, well-crafted artifacts. And they're showing us examples of certain types of things that are just amazing. And we also have, for whatever reason, really good preservation in some of the sites due to the, I believe, through the soil chemistry. So we get things like this. Rope and cordage and things that normally would deteriorate are often preserved in sites. So we do tend to get a lot of material in the sites that you don't tend to get elsewhere, which helps us to be able to interpret and put together what was going on there historically. Your typical archaeological site looks something like this. Big pile of abalone shells. Actually, they're eating more fish than they're eating shellfish, but the fish bones are so small you don't see them right off. So if you see that many shells, there's about 10 times as much fish bone in that same photo that you just can't see. And it's a very typical site would look something like this, where you've got the shell and the fish bone. You see here the way the soil is a little darker color in through here. That's the actual living surface where they were living. And by living there, they've changed the chemistry. They've added humus, they've added materials to the soil. And it makes this characteristically dark soil. On top of, in this case, it's on top of the sand dune, which is a very typical site on the island. On San Nicolas Island, we also have one of the few very nice rock art sites on the Channel Islands. San Nicolas and Catalina has a couple of similar kind of real nice sites. Very little, if any, on the northern islands. But if you notice, these are all marine life. It just kind of emphasizes their connection to the marine environment, how important it was for them in terms of food, in terms of building materials. As I said, there are no trees, so your biggest and best building material comes from whales washing up on shore. Lots of big bones come with the whale. You see some of the stuff up here on stage even. That's the kind of stuff you can build with. You can build a structure out of that. You can't out of the little shrubs that are on the island. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of background about the island, what it is, and where it is. Now I want to get into the actual story of the lone woman. And the story can be broken down into basically 3 chapters. Okay? She was abandoned on the island in 1835, left alone. Okay? She lived alone by herself for 18 years, and then she was rescued, in quotes, brought back to Santa Barbara in 1853. Okay? Now we do know a fair bit about what happened when she was found, what happened when she was brought to Santa Barbara. Okay? We know a bit about the circumstances of her being abandoned on the island, but there's so many different versions of this story, it's hard to tell what's real and what isn't. There's still lots and lots of questions about this whole phase, and I'll let you know what those are. But this is very much in doubt. The survival phase, since no one else was there, no one could talk to her when she came off the island, we don't know. We really don't know anything about it. I can make a lot of supposition based upon what I know about the island and about the cultures on the island as to what she might have done. But we really don't know. So I can't really say much about that. I'll say a few things about that, but not too much. But we'll try to give you the rest of the story. And once again, I'm just focusing on the facts of the story. And there's a fact here and a fact there. And how you piece them together is up to you. That's the beauty of a historical novel. You can fill in between the facts with any kind of story you want to make up. Okay? As long as you kind of, at least lock it down with the facts as you go along, no one can argue and say you've done a poor job. This is a map of California in 1823. As you can see, if you're familiar with the actual layout of the coast and where the islands actually are, it's not real accurate. But this is the state of knowledge at the time the story starts. Okay, just to give you a little background. Now I'm going to back up a little bit and give you a little bit of a preface to the story. Okay, before we actually get into her story, we have to talk a little bit about how she got to be there. Okay. Now the island was occupied, we know, for several thousand years before our story commences. We know from archaeology that at least 8,000 years, maybe as much as 11,000 years ago, people have been living on that island. Okay. One of the questions everyone always asks is, well, how many people were living on the island? The very simple answer to that is, I don't know. I can guess, and maybe have an educated guess of 200 to 300 people, based upon what we know from other areas where we do have better records, and based upon the size of the island. 200 to 300 people seems a reasonable number to me. You may have seen, if you've done any reading, estimates as high as 1,200 people being on the island. Okay, I don't refute that, but if you read the rest of that article, it also goes on to explain that that is assuming all the sites on the island, none of them are older than 2,000 years ago. So if you took that assumption for 2,000 years, just stretched it out to 8,000 years, all of a sudden your number of people goes down. Because now they have more time to accumulate all the material on the island. So it's not contrary to that at all. It's just a different time perspective. So we have 200 to 300 people on the island. When our story really gets going, though, we're told by the historical accounts that there are between 20 and 30 people on the island. What happened to the rest of them? And you'll read, if you haven't already, a number of different stories about how the Indians came to vacate the island. One of the more popular ones, and it is based, in fact, to a certain extent, is that early in the 1800s, around 1800, 1801, Russian companies started to come down to hunt otters. As I said, there's lots of otters, remember? And these companies, in order to hunt the otters, they brought with them expert otter hunters. And these are Native Americans they obtained up in Alaska. Called Aleuts or Aleuts, specifically generally attributed to Kodiak Island. They were brought down and they really knew how to hunt otters. The only problem is they kind of got hoodwinked into the whole process. They were up in Alaska and someone asked them if they'd like to come and go otter hunting. So they said, sure, that's what we do, we hunt otters. Well, they didn't count on being transported 2,000 miles from home, being dropped off on an island for several months at a time. So they were a little bit disgruntled, as you might imagine. And as the story goes, they got rather upset, and being a little bit of a more violent nature than the natives, they tended to have hostile encounters with the natives. And specifically with San Nicolas Island, the story usually goes something like they had a big battle and they killed off all the males so they could take the women. Now, I've never seen any historical accounts to back that up. There are some historical accounts of the Aleuts coming down and sacking, like Santa Barbara, a number of times, and various towns along the way, but no indication that they actually went through and exterminated people in any particular given area. But it could be. Okay. Most of those accounts, however, are based upon the fact that people are going out to San Nicolas Island and they're finding areas covered with human bone all over the surface. And their summation is that this is the result of some kind of horrendous battle where people were killed left and right and just left there, just lying on the ground. Okay. We now know what they're actually seeing is the cemeteries of the Indians. And the cemeteries often are placed in sandy areas. And once the erosion got started again after sheep ranching, the sand tended to blow away. And so what you end up with no sand, you end up with all the bones laying on the surface. And instead of seeing the result of one battle, you're seeing the result of hundreds of years of people dying on the island. So we know that those observations are not exactly what they were originally reported to be. We know that there's no real good historical documentation about confrontations between the Aleuts and the natives. Could have happened, quite possibly. However, a more reasonable explanation is probably that the natives succumbed due to the introduction of European diseases. Okay, the Russians certainly had direct contact, and later it was American companies who were doing the same thing. I'm going to blame everything on the Russians. But before them, of course, the Spanish were over in California. They brought diseases with them. Diseases spread very quickly, and if you don't have any resistance to a given disease, you can be seriously injured or die. Just as an example, if you're familiar with the first group of Eskimos that were taken out of the Arctic and taken to England to be presented to the Queen, they all died within about a week or two by exposure to common cold. They never had colds in the Arctic. That was a disease that just wiped them out entirely. And so if you're a native out here and these Europeans are coming in with much nastier diseases, spreading them around, they could quickly get to you, even though, so for example, the Spanish never made it to San Nicolas Island directly. If an Indian from somewhere else, where they were, went to Catalina, and from Catalina went out to San Nicolas, they could have spread diseases very, very rapidly, and could very easily explain why the population dropped as much as it did. Okay. And this is something we could probably see archaeologically if we had, skeletons that show evidence of diseases and whatnot. We don't at this point in time, but it's certainly I think a probably much more reasonable explanation as to what happened to them. But at any rate, the population had dropped down significantly by the time our story begins. When about 1825 is the first time that someone actually goes out to the island, locally at any rate, and mentions that they actually went to the island. At this time, a gentleman from San Pedro went out to the island, and according to him, there were 25 to 35 people on the island. He went back to San Pedro. This was known. About 10 years later, in 1835, the Padres at the mission decided it was time that someone went out and gathered up the natives and bring them back to become part of the mission system, become civilized, whatever you want to say. At that time, a ship was dispatched to collect up the natives on the island. Okay. The name of the ship was the POS Nada, which translates as basically better than nothing. And everyone always laughs at that. Well, if you think about it, if you go out here in the harbor and look at how people name their boats, if your boat really was better than nothing, you wouldn't call it that, now would you? So it's just kind of a fun little part of the story. We don't know anything about the boat, other than it was involved in the otter trade up and down the coast. It had been down in Mexico recently a couple of times. It was up here. It was subsequently lost, capsized off of Golden Gate. But it came out to collect up the natives. When it left, they took all the natives except for one woman who was left behind. That's the lone woman, Juana Maria Carona in the novel, same person. And there are a number of explanations as to how she got left behind. This is one of the real compelling questions of the whole thing. How did she get left behind? Well, let me share with you some of the versions of how she got left behind that have all appeared in print. These are pretty much from the earliest known account coming through time. And if you notice, they kind of get a little bit more elaborate, a little more flowery each time. You got to remember, this is going back, some of these are in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. They're Victorian times. All literature is kind of flowery and romantic. So as you can see, we've got a variety of stories to choose from, which ones to believe, which ones to cast aside. We can take a look at them. Okay. As I said, this part here, the boat left due to a gale. Remember I said it's real windy on the island? That's why that point is important. It does get very windy. The winds do come up abruptly, so that it's quite possible that a gale could have come up and the boat could have had to have left very, very abruptly. And if someone wasn't on board, they could have been left behind. That's quite possible. Okay. The stories that are in most of the literature you'll read have to do with her jumping overboard because she realized her child had been left behind. So she swims back to the island to save her child. Okay. I have no facts, but personally I have some problems with that story. I'll give you some very good reasons why maybe we should adopt that version of the story. Okay. Now, if there were 100, 200 people coming down to get on a boat, you might overlook someone. Agreed? Well, what if there's 4 people on the island? Think you're going to miss somebody? No. By best accounts, there were 4 to 7 people on the island at that time. So it makes me think, well, missing somebody doesn't seem quite as plausible if that's the full number of people. Actually, 4 appears to be the most credible number because in the accounts that mentioned 4, they mentioned 4 specific people and where they went to and what they did. Okay, they mentioned the woman who was left behind, mentioned 2 women who were brought over to the mainland and went to live on one of the local ranchos, and 1 man who went over and continued to work in the harbor area offloading boats. They actually mentioned 4 specific people where they went. The others will be 4, be 7, 6, 8, 10, 12, as much as 19 even is mentioned. And maybe the accounts don't actually account for every single person who was there, but it's a pretty small number of people. Therefore, I would tend to think the smaller number of people, the less likely you are to forget somebody, especially a small child. Secondly, if it's a small child, and by all accounts we're talking an infant, I don't know of any mother who wouldn't be first and foremost thinking about where their infant was at a time when they knew they were leaving the island. So I have a little hard time believing that. The third reason I really doubt that story is because that story always ends up with, by the time she got back to find the child had been eaten by the wild dogs. Okay, don't leave the kids at home alone with dogs. The Indians did have dogs on the island. We know that. We've excavated their remains. 2 or 3 different varieties. Been there for at least a few thousand years. Dogs among Native Americans are typically used as work animals, so not really pets, but they're there to work, to help with hunting, or help be pack animals to move things. In the Great Plains, they would pack stuff on the dogs, have a little sled that they would drag to move from place to place. And a work dog, typically you would keep penned up, and he would keep fed. Animals no good if it's not fed. Okay, so they're cared for. They're not pets, but they're being cared for and taken care of. So to think that within an hour or so, this dogs turn wild and start eating people seems a little far-fetched to me. You can make your own opinion on that. Seems a bit much to me. So I tend to kind of doubt these stories. All we can really say is she got left behind. We're not really sure why. But just to throw a little more confusion, there are other versions of the story. I'll just give you just a few, just to show you how far they can vary from what we think we know. Kind of from the sublime to the ridiculous. There was no Bureau of Indian Affairs at the time, if you didn't catch that far. And these have all appeared in print in reputable journals and attested to as being the truth of the story. So like I said, there's a lot of confusion about this part of the story. Okay, you can believe what you want. We're probably never going to really know. Maybe someday we may discover some narrative that somebody who was actually involved in that part of the story had written down. One of the other problems is most of the people who tell us what happened at this phase were the people who were involved in the last phase, the rescue or discovery of her. They had nothing to do with this part of the story. They had to do everything to do with the last part of the story. So they don't really have any more knowledge about what happened than anybody else did on the first part of the story. So you got to keep that in mind when you're looking at historical documents. Who's saying it? Are they really in a position to know what they're saying? And can we verify what they're saying? So that kind of takes care of the first part of the story, the abandonment kind of chapter, if you will. Okay. As I said, that first group was brought into San Pedro. We know that. San Pedro wasn't much more other than this building here, with a little bit of a landing, not even a pier or a wharf even at that time. Just a place where you would anchor offshore and you could use smaller boats to bring your supplies on shore. We're told that two of the women were brought up, went to live on one of the local ranchos. So we might be able to find some documentation that would call them out, possibly, in their records. We're told that the man who was brought off, who apparently, according to them, was injured. He may have been blind in one eye. He had worked in the harbor for a number of years, helping to offload these boats when they would come on shore. And he subsequently died in an accident. He drowned in the harbor and was buried out here on Dead Man's Island, we're told. Unfortunately, Dead Man's Island was later removed to make way for Los Angeles Harbor. But we do have a little bit of story as to what happened to at least those three people who were brought in to San Pedro. And so it's possible there might be something in some obscure places down there that will give us some more information about what happened. One of the neat things that's happening now is, now that we have everything computerized just about, more and more things are becoming available online, and you can do a quick little search. And you can find things that before would take you years of going through, like old newspapers, going through page by page to find something. Well, you can just do a search. And in 10 seconds, know if your place is ever mentioned in there. Especially the early newspaper where they didn't have headlines. They just had little story after little story after little story. You have to really read each and every page. Another part of the story that has to do with the intervening 18 years is the other part of the story is that there were no boats on the coast during those 18 years big enough to go out to San Nicolas Island to get the lone woman. It was common knowledge. There are written accounts in 1840 and 1849 that talk about her being out there. By 1850, when it starts, she gets talked about again. It's not a big surprise. In 51, 52, and 53, when she's finally found, it's no big surprise. But just everyone had thought that she had probably perished by that time. Okay. But if you know a little bit about the history, the fact that there were no boats big enough is not at all true. And I offer up as the one piece of evidence, this map, which you notice was made in 1847, while she was there on the island somewhere, by yourself, the HMS Pandora came out and mapped the island. Came out and mapped Big Rock, probably mostly concerned about where Big Rock was, because ships kept running into Big Rock. But they were out there long enough to have mapped the island. There are several other accounts of other boats that sailed by in 1840, 49, various other years we know of. And generally there were plenty of boats on the coast that could have gone out to pick her up if anyone had actually really wanted to try. I think one of the sad parts of the story is the fact that at that time, a lone Indian left on an island didn't really merit a whole lot of effort to go and recover. That was just the times, just the mores, the beliefs of the time. And she was left out there, and after some point in time, everyone assumed that she had probably just died. Nobody knew, but that was just kind of a general belief with that. Later matter. A couple of other questions that I'm always asked about during that 18 years that she was alone was where did she live? And the simple answer to that is wherever she wanted to. She had a whole island to choose from. The natives on the island, there's no evidence we have found that indicates that they would live in one spot for terribly long as their normal routine. So there's no reason to think that she would have altered that in any way. When the groups went out to the island to look for her, they found huts scattered around in various different places on the island that looked like they had been used, maybe not in the immediate past, but not in the not too distant past. So there were at least several other structures they found where she could have been living. Some accounts talk about her living in a cave on the island for some period of time. And most people have assumed, and I get this a lot, that the place where she was found was where she had lived for the whole 18 years. And I've got a pretty good idea on where she was found, and it's sitting on the top of a sand dune to the west end of the island. And remember that wind? When that wind kicks up, you don't want to be sitting on top of a sand dune. That's the last place in the world you want to be. So I'm sure she moved around the island as she wanted to. Where she was found is not near any of the springs, so she would have had to go on for water and other things at various times of year. It's not, it's fairly close to food, but she would have moved around as she wanted to. There's no reason why she wouldn't have. And the other question I'm always asked is, well, how did she survive? How did she make it on her own? Well, as I showed you before, there's lots of shellfish, lots of fish out there. Getting food is not a problem. Like I said, there's probably 200 to 300 natives living out there typically. And at that population size, they're probably spending 1 day a week getting food. It doesn't take long to gather up enough food when it's that abundant and that easily accessible. So for her, she wouldn't have no problem at all getting food. Her only issues would be how does she survive psychologically. She's got whatever tools and structures and things were left at the time to make use of. She didn't have a real hard physically, but it's all mentally and how you deal with that. And we talked to some psychologists, and everyone seems to agree that the most reasonable thing that she probably would have done was to bond with the dogs and the foxes that are on the island. They would have become her companions for that time. It's some kind of a living creature that you can tell, everybody likes dogs, and would have been a real good companion while you were there by yourself. And very reasonable thing to expect someone would have done. Other than that, I really can't say much about what she did or didn't do during those 18 years. Now, for the last chapter, we introduce this gentleman, George Snyder, who's a very important part of the story. Starting about 1850 or 51, George Snyder started going out to San Nicolas Island. He was an otter hunter at the time. He had been working up and down Baja California, throughout the Channel Islands, Southern California area. And about 1851, he mentions that when he was on San Nicolas Island, they found a footprint that appeared to be too small to be from any of the men that were on the crew. So they started to think, well, maybe there was someone else on the island. And it was small, so maybe it was a woman's foot. They thought about that for a while, and they weren't sure how long the footprint had been there. Maybe it had been there a while, someone else had been out they didn't know about. But this started this whole talk about, oh, maybe she did survive. Maybe she did make it somehow. So George comes out again in 1852, the next year. This time, he finds I'm going to throw this one here. A little easier for you. This is a map of the island, just kind of showing you some of the landmarks I'm talking about. When they would come out, they would anchor it down to this end of the island. Here we've got marked the anchors. Don't know where he went to in 1851. Probably up along this side of the island, which is pretty typical. In 1852, we know approximately up in here, he found in the branches of a bush or a tree, depending on how you want to interpret the language, probably a bush and started growing many of trees, he found a basket. And in this basket were a variety of artifacts, fish hooks and bone needles and knives and pieces of skins, rope, etc. And so then they started to think, well, maybe someone is here. And so someone had the idea that, well, they should take the basket back with them as evidence. Well, someone else had the really bright idea, very, very clever idea, of taking the basket and dumping out all the contents on the ground. The thought being that if she was still there, she would find that and put the stuff back in the basket where she had wanted it to be in the first place. So he dumped everything out on the ground, went off and went otter hunting for another couple of weeks, came back, and sure enough, everything had been put back in the basket, and the basket was back in the bush where it had been in the first place. So this kind of convinced him that there was definitely someone else on the island, and odds are it was the lone woman, because there was nobody else known to be out there. No one else who would have cared about a basket full of fish hooks and bone needles and bone knives and things like that. So they were starting to think that she really was out there. So George makes another trip out the next year, 1853. While he's otter hunting, he's not going out of his way just to go, but he's hunting for otters on the way. And this time they look around the island for a brief period of time. They don't find her, but they have to leave because the weather is turning bad and they've got to go. So he gets his boat and he heads back to behind San Miguel Island. About a month later, he heads back out to San Nicolas Island. And this time he's convinced if she's there, he's going to find her. So when he comes out this time, they anchor down here at the east end of the island, as they usually do. It's the only protected place, and it's still where you would anchor today. They make their way up along the north coast, we can tell by the accounts. As they pass through here, they find a number of structures, huts, or actually the way they describe them, they're more windbreaks, which is really what you need out there, is some way to get out of the wind. So there are at least some structures on this part of the island. Okay, they establish their camp on this beach here, which is a very central location on the island. It's a real nice little spot. There's a spring there, etc. Then what he does is he spreads his men out across the island, and they decide they're going to search the island. They're going to go this way first, and then I'm assuming he probably would have tried this way next if they didn't find her. But he spreads everyone out this way, and they start heading towards the west tip of the island. One of the men, Charles Dittman, also called Charlie Brown, is the one who walks up along the coast. He comes all the way around the coast. He comes up around the point of the island, the very tip of the island. And as he's coming back up this side, he sees up off the beach a piece of wood laying on the ground. And he figures that this is a piece of driftwood, but it's too high up to have washed there by the waves. So he's thinking that someone carried that and dropped it. Someone was going up the hill. So he proceeded to go up to the top of that hill, and sure enough, there he found a little woman in a little brush hut, sitting there working away on some baskets and other things she had. And she had with her 2 dogs by her side. Not knowing what she's going to do, if she's going to run away or whatever, he kind of gets behind her where he can't be seen, and he signals to the other men who are down here at this point, and they all kind of come up and converge on her at her hut side. And as they're getting closer, the dogs start to bark. She tells them something and they stop barking. So they are more of her pets now, her companions. And the men come up and she greets them. They can't understand her language because they don't speak the language, but they know they're being greeted. She offers them some roots that she had been cooking. Very cordial. They indicate to her through sign language that she needs to pick up her belongings and go with them. And she's kind of, I suppose, at this point expecting that, maybe hoping, or maybe she gave up hope entirely. But, oh, you hear? Well, okay, I saw the hope. At some point, you're probably going to give up on the hope of being rescued. So she proceeds with them, and we're told by the accounts they walk down towards a spring that's on the beach, and it matches the description of the spring here very, very well. From that spring, they walk up along the beach to another spring, and this spring she stops and she washes herself. Okay, the first spring, she picks up some objects she has there, and this one she washes. Then they proceed to walk up to where their camp had been established. Still not sure what she's going to do, thinking maybe she's still going to run away. They immediately take her out and put her on a boat. Can't run too far on a boat, can you? After about a day or so, they realize that she has no, she's very complacent and happy and not going anywhere. So they take her back and they put her there in camp with everybody else. And they proceed to go off and hunt otters for a month. And while she's there in camp, and she's working on she's got a whole variety of baskets that are kind of half made and things she's sewing that are kind of half made. She tinkers with one, tinkers with another, just never seemed to finish anything, but was always working on something, is the way it's described. So just to give you a few visuals, this is approximately where she was found, up on top of a sand dune, right about this part of the island. As I said, she was in a little dome brush hut, and there were 2 or 3 others in the immediate vicinity. So there were little huts all around the island that they were seeing. That's why I said she probably moved around quite a bit while she was there and looked at it. Can't find my photo of the first spring, but the second spring is this one here. It's now called Thousand Springs because it kind of drifts down in lots of different places like this, a very little picturesque little spot where she came. And then she went down to this beach where they had camped out. This is a popular spot. Lots of other people who were coming out. Afterwards, camped in this area. It's a real pleasant little spot to camp. There's a spring right here. It's a real nice, fairly pleasant beach during most of the time. So we can kind of, from the accounts that were written down, we can kind of tell where they were and what they did on the way there. Okay. Now, as I said, they stayed on the island for about a month and continued to hunt otters. After which they packed up everything and they returned to Santa Barbara, which is where Snyder was based. And so the lone wolf was brought back to Santa Barbara. And she went to live with Niders at their house in Santa Barbara. This is Santa Barbara at the time. This is 1853 map. Santa Barbara's not real big at the time, as you can see. The mission's back up here somewhere, so it's a little, real sleepy little pueblo town at the time. And this creates quite a stir now. The woman she is actually alive. She's been found. She's been brought back to Santa Barbara. Lots of people coming to town and want to see her. We have found very, very recently a few newspaper accounts now that were written while she was in Santa Barbara. People who had come to see her and have written down some of what they had to say. So we're starting to get a little bit of information, some actual credible source at the time, things written at the time. The one thing everyone kind of mentions frequently is as she got off the boat, she saw a man on a horse and was totally amazed by a man on a horse. Of course, she'd never seen a man on a horse before, never seen a horse before. And by what everyone had deduced is that she had assumed that the horse and the man were one. They were one animal until the guy got off the horse. That is really amazing. And this is a fairly common perception of the Native Americans when they first were introduced to men on horses. When Cortez came into Mexico, a lot of similar things are said about their impression of what they were seeing at that time. It was totally amazing. What is this odd beast? Especially with a man stuck on top, the man and an animal. What is it? So she was pretty amazed by that. They took her back into town. She appears to have been fairly happy. She's talked about it as just jibber-jabbering a lot. No one could understand the language, though. As I said, she was from a whole different language family than the Chumash Indians who were in Santa Barbara. So the fact no one could talk to her is not unreasonable. Okay. They had started to figure this out, so they had started to send for Indians from other places that maybe they would be able to talk to her. Maybe there were some words in common if they went further south or further north. They weren't sure exactly what her language was. So they did send out. They kind of realized that maybe it's not Chumash, but it's another language, so they did do that much. But she was known to play with the children a lot. She was always giving away some of the objects she had. She was dancing a lot, just kind of generally having a real good time. Unfortunately, she only lived for a few weeks in Santa Barbara. I can say at least 4 weeks, maybe a little bit more. It's still kind of unclear as to exactly when she got to Santa Barbara. We don't know her exact date of death. But it's at least 4 weeks, maybe 5 or 6 possibly. There are a number of suppositions about what happened to her. One is that her diet changed so drastically that the food she was eating killed her. I've been in other countries eating weird things. It never killed me. But the other was she contracted dysentery, okay, a disease which she had no immunity to. That sounds very reasonable. Or it could have been any number of other diseases she had no immunity to, could have killed her very quickly. Some people attribute part of her problems to the fact that supposedly she fell off the porch one time and hurt her back, and that may have caused an infection or some other kind of complicating medical condition. But at any rate, we do know that she did not last very long in Santa Barbara. As I said, lots of people came to her. At that time, it was a big thing. You know, Barnum was going around looking for weird things to put on display, and Barnum and someone else had offered basically to buy her from Snyder to put her on display, and Snyder refused. But that was just part of the times. You know, curiosities were a big thing at that time. 1850s, 60s, people are just, you know, the world is just getting connected, and people are hearing about weird things and odd stories coming from around the world. So people are really interested whenever something like that happens. So it's a pretty common thing to have that happen. It would not be unexpected whatsoever. We do know that she did have a few artifacts, and we can trace what happened to some of those, and some of those are actually still around. Okay. This is one of her most famous artifacts. This is a water bottle, which is woven. It's actually woven fabric. It's made from the seagrass, which grows out on the island. And to make it watertight, what she would do was she would take the asphaltum, or the tar that washes up on the beach, melt it down, and coat the inside and outside of this woven bottle so it would hold water. Very ingenious. She had a necklace along these lines, made of limpet shells. She had a bone knife, something along this lines. She's also known to have had a little steel knife that she had made. She did have a number of other items which are now been dispersed around. Currently at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, there are 2 of her artifacts on display. One is a shellfish hook she had, and the other is a bone needle that she had. I was just told last night that they do have that up on exhibit now. It's available if you would like to see those. There are various other items that have been kind of scattered around the world. Her most famous article, however, was her cormorant skin dress. Actually, she had probably 3 or 4 of these, which explains some of the confusion. One of these, supposedly, was sent by the Padres at the mission to the Vatican. The Vatican has an incredible museum of stuff from all around the world. It's one of the biggest museums in the world. They have incredible collections of things. Whenever priests would go out to various parts of the world, they would send things back to the Vatican to become part of the collections there. Unfortunately, the Vatican says they never received any such cloak. But we do know another similar cloak was donated to the California Academy of Sciences, and there was another one who was given to someone locally. So she had a few of these things that they were spread around. A number of the artifacts were donated to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, which unfortunately was hit by a huge earthquake in 1906, and most of the city burned down, including a number of artifacts, specifically the water ball I just showed you. So we have lost some of those things, but others are still around, and we might still yet be able to track down some more. Someone has just tracked down another one of her artifacts. It's in a museum back in New York. So some of these things are out there, and we'll be able to find quite a few of them here. Now, she was buried at the Santa Barbara Mission. At her death, she was baptized with the name Juana Maria. She died October 19, 1853. Is buried somewhere on the mission grounds. If you go there, there's a little memorial plaque to her. It doesn't mark the gravesite, it just marks the fact that she is buried there in the grave area of the mission. And this is the only photograph we have which might be her. Like that one, don't you? This photograph was found in George Snyder's attic. There's nothing written on it. Nothing identifies who it is, but it would appear to be a Native American, perhaps in her 50s, which is how she's generally described as being about in her early 50s. Most people agree on that. So this might be a photograph of her. Might not be, but it's the best we have at this point in time. And if we can ever figure it out, we certainly will. There's still, like I said, lots of other avenues of researching these little bits and pieces. They kind of go off in all kinds of different directions, and it takes a while to track them down. But every year, more and more of the information comes out, and eventually we'll be able to piece together even more of the story, I'm sure. So that's basically the story, as well as I know it at this point in time. I'd be happy to hang around for any questions anyone might have. Thank you all very much.
If you have any questions you'd like to ask, feel free.
The Fish and Wildlife Service introduced 139 otters to San Nicolas Island. A lot of those either went back where they came from in Monterey or have just disappeared. We currently have about 30-some otters on the island. Fish and Wildlife Service recently declared the translocation program a failure, which is just kind of a legal thing, just to stopping the funding for it and all this kind of other thing. But we do have a small population of otter out there, which has been increasing. It was down very low, about 12 or 14 at one time, and now it's up into the 30s, and maybe even more than that. So they're out there, they've been reestablished, and hopefully they can just remain there and continue to grow. We're still waiting to see what Fish and Wildlife Service is going to do. From a legal standpoint, now it's been declared a failure. They have various legal agreements they have to comply with to do that. We have facilitated that and done what we can to assist them in doing it, but it's their effort.
Is there much of an understanding at the time, other than the fact they couldn't understand her, of the different languages of the Native American area?
There was not a real great understanding. There were people, especially some of the Padres definitely knew, because they were setting up missions in various territories, and they knew that there were definitely different languages. They didn't know where the boundaries were between them necessarily. But they did know at this mission they spoke this language, at this mission they spoke another language. And they had actually sent for someone from the San Fernando mission. And the San Fernando mission is within the Gabrielino territory. So if that person had made it there in time, might have been able to communicate with her. Now, just to add to that a little bit, there were 4 words that she said, and somehow through sign language passed along the meaning of those 4 words. And those 4 words were passed down, passed down, passed down. until somebody actually wrote them down, which is often the case. Those 4 words, we've taken those to a linguist who's a specialist in the Uto-Aztecan languages, which is the language family that the Gabrielinos speak. And she said, based upon the 4 words, and it's not a lot, but based upon those, it is very consistent with Gabrielino. It's definitely not Chumash, but it is consistent with a Uto-Aztecan language like Gabrielino. She also has, I said, she's sung a number of songs, and some of those songs were then remembered and repeated and eventually written down many, many years later. And so we had her also look at the songs, and so she couldn't make any sense out of the songs. It could have just been la 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 for all anyone could tell, but they didn't. Of course, they haven't been passed down from person to person to person. And a song, you don't always hear the words real clearly in a song. It could have easily been botched up. So we were really hoping that the songs might actually have a lot of information in them. That, much more than the 4 words. That's not a whole lot to base any analysis on, but consistently with the U.S. technology. The 4 words were the word for man. Don't ask me to repeat it. The word for hide. The word for sky. Ooh, you're going to get me on this one.
Always come unprepared, honestly.
I didn't put on my cheat sheet. Well, the words, I'm sorry, but they're well known, and they're real basic kind of words. That's why, and in the linguistic, if you've ever seen a linguistic analysis, they take a word and they separate it into little pieces and show how this is from that root and that root. And it's all very high-tech stuff. But it was fairly impressive, at least, that she was able to do that much with just 4 words.
Steve can send me the other word and I'll email it to Mr. Sperry's class, okay?
I'd be happy to. Go here.
The hide, what she said, do you mean like an animal hide or like a hide?
Animal hide. Probably a seal skin. Lots of seals out there, so it's easy to get seal skins out there.
What is the status of, the current status of the Gabrielino and Chumash languages? Are there speakers of those languages?